The most common criticism of Tolkien's story is also one of the most persistent. If the eagles were powerful enough to carry Frodo to Mount Doom, why didn't they? It is a question that has followed the books and films for decades, and it has never been answered to most people's satisfaction. The answer exists. It is not in a footnote or a deleted scene. It is built into the foundational logic of how Tolkien constructed his world, and understanding it requires going back much further than the War of the Ring. The question at the center of this is not simply tactical, it is moral. Why do the most powerful beings in Middle-earth consistently withhold their power while the world around them deteriorates? The eagles watch from mountain peaks. Gandalf operates within visible limits. The Valar, the governing powers of Tolkien's cosmology, remain behind the sea for centuries while Sauron expands his dominion across the east. When these powers do act, the intervention is narrow and late, sufficient to prevent total collapse, but never enough to resolve the conflict decisively. This was not oversight, it was design. A deliberate, philosophically grounded policy that was built into the structure of Tolkien's creation mythology, and the reasoning behind it is more consequential than it first appears.
To understand the eagles, it is necessary to begin at the beginning of Tolkien's cosmology. In the Ainulindale, the first text of the Silmarillion, Tolkien describes creation as an act of divine music. Ilúvatar, the supreme deity of this world, sings the universe into existence alongside a chorus of spiritual beings called the Ainur. From among the Ainur, the greatest become the Valar, the powers who physically shape Middle-earth. The lesser Ainur, the Maiar, serve beneath them. Gandalf was a Maia. Sauron was a Maia, and the eagles, at least in their origins, were instruments of Manwë, the Lord of Winds and the highest among the Valar, whose domain encompassed the air and everything that moved through it. Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, and before him Thorondor, the greatest eagle ever to live, were not ordinary creatures. They were appointed emissaries, dispatched on specific, sanctioned missions at Manwë's direction. The word sanctioned carries the full weight of what follows. These beings did not operate freely. They acted within permissions granted from above, according to a governing principle that had been established long before the Third Age began. That principle can be illustrated simply. A physician may possess the medicine to cure a patient, but administering it without the patient's consent does not constitute healing. It constitutes control. The condition is removed, but the person's capacity to choose has been overridden. In Tolkien's moral framework, that distinction is not incidental, it is foundational.
The Valar had not always operated this way. In the First Age, when Morgoth, the original Dark Power, whose evil dwarfed anything Sauron would later attempt, began his systematic conquest of the world, the Valar eventually intervened in force. They came with their full power. They ended Morgoth, and the conflict that accomplished this, known as the War of Wrath, destroyed a substantial portion of the world in the process. The northwestern regions of Middle-earth were submerged. Entire geographies were lost. Civilizations that had survived centuries of Morgoth's rule did not survive the war that removed him. The Valar had acted decisively, and the world bore the physical cost of that decision for the remainder of its existence. Beyond the territorial destruction, there was a deeper consequence. The peoples of Middle-earth, who had fought across those ages and watched the gods arrive, reshape everything, and then depart, came away with an altered relationship to divine intervention. The rescue had been real. The damage had also been real. When the Second Age began and Sauron started his long consolidation of power in the east, the Valar responded differently. They would not send armies. They would not deploy their full capacity. Instead, they sent emissaries, beings deliberately limited in what they were permitted to do. The Istari, the order to which Gandalf belonged, were not sent to overpower Sauron. They were sent, as Tolkien wrote in his letters, to inspire resistance in the peoples of Middle-earth, and to counsel and encourage them. They were explicitly forbidden from matching Sauron's power with power, and from seeking to dominate men and elves through their own authority. The eagles operated within a similar framework. They were not a reserve force to be deployed at scale. They were targeted instruments, used sparingly and precisely within the boundaries of what had been sanctioned.
The implications of this framework extend well beyond the practical.
What it means, in effect, is that every extended period of suffering in Middle-earth, every war prolonged, every people subjugated, every civilization lost, unfolded within the deliberate tolerance of powers capable of intervening more forcefully. The men of Númenor were the most gifted mortal civilization in the history of Middle-earth. They fell, over the course of centuries, to Sauron's patient manipulation. The Valar watched. They issued warnings. They did not remove Sauron from Númenor by force. It was only when Númenor's fleet sailed directly toward the Undying Lands, the physical home of the Valar themselves, that Ilúvatar intervened, and the response reshaped the physical structure of the world. The earth was bent. The Undying Lands were removed from the geographical reach of mortal navigation entirely. Each act of divine power at scale carried a permanent physical cost. That cost had been paid once already in the War of Wrath. The Valar understood the terms. Their restraint in the ages that followed was not indifference. It was a policy derived from experience.
Tolkien addressed the Eagle's question directly in his private letters. He was clear that the mission of the Astari, and by extension the sanctioned agents of the Valar, was never to solve the problem of Sauron through superior force. The ring could not be transported to Mount Doom by an eagle, because that act would have transferred the decisive moral weight of the story's resolution away from the beings for whom the struggle was designed to matter. Tolkien used a specific term for the kind of resolution he believed a meaningful story required: eucatastrophe. He defined it as a sudden, unexpected turn toward grace, not earned in the conventional sense, but arrived at through genuine effort, genuine failure, and something beyond rational expectation. Frodo reaches the crack of doom and cannot complete the task. The ring is destroyed anyway through the intervention of Gollum, whose own long history of possession and suffering becomes, in that moment, the instrument of resolution. An eagle delivering the ring to the fire would have produced the same physical outcome. It would not have produced the same moral one. The destruction of the ring would have been an operation, not a reckoning. Tolkien's argument, made both in his fiction and in his correspondence, was that the manner of salvation carries meaning that the fact of salvation alone cannot provide. A freedom arranged for you by an outside power is a different thing from a freedom arrived at through your own agency, however compromised and incomplete that agency may be. The eagles were kept at the margins because the center of the story had to remain with the small, the frightened, and the flawed.
Tolkien was a practicing Catholic, and that context shapes the architecture of his world in ways that are consistent but rarely explicit. The Valar's restraint reflects a theological position on providence, that a God who overrides human will, even in the service of good outcomes, has done something that cannot be fully reconciled with the value of human freedom. The suffering that unfolds within that restraint is not incidental. It is the cost of preserving the conditions under which genuine choice remains possible. This creates a tension that Tolkien does not fully resolve and appears to have left unresolved deliberately. The same framework that produces Frodo's journey also produces the drowning of Númenor, the long domination of entire peoples, and centuries of war that might have ended sooner had the Valar chosen to intervene more directly. There is a passage in the Silmarillion in which Manwë is described weeping, observing the suffering of Middle-earth from his mountain throne and not descending. The image is precise in its ambiguity. It does not present him as uncaring. It presents him as having made a decision about what the use of his power would cost the people below, and having accepted the grief that decision requires. Whether that constitutes wisdom or a form of abandonment is a question the text raises without answering. Tolkien appears to have believed that the question itself was the point, that a cosmology which answered it cleanly would have misrepresented the nature of the problem.
The eagles, understood in this context, are not a narrative convenience or an oversight. They are a precise expression of the moral logic governing Tolkien's world. They arrive at the edge of permitted intervention. They carry the survivors home. They do not descend sooner, because descending sooner would have altered something more important than the outcome. The resolution of the War of the Ring, precarious, incomplete, achieved at significant cost, is, by Tolkien's own account, more valuable than a clean victory would have been. Not because suffering is desirable, but because the alternative would have required removing from the story's central figures the very capacity that made their participation meaningful.
Middle-earth, in Tolkien's construction, required saving by the people who lived in it. The eagles were present to witness that and to carry its survivors forward. That was the limit of their sanction, and Tolkien held to it without apology. That restraint, however, created a vulnerability that Tolkien also documented in detail. If the governing powers of a world operate within deliberate limits, if their mercy and their philosophical commitments constrain how they respond, then an adversary who understands those limits can build a strategy around them. Sauron understood this. The rings of power were not simply weapons. They were constructed with a precise knowledge of what the Valar would and would not do in response, and that calculation shaped everything that followed.